Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, September 23rd, 2016. What's happening? I don't know. It's Friday. We'll pretend like nothing's happening and try and get out of here without reporting any news whatsoever. Greg Dworkin making it easy by not showing up today because he's showing up for work, curing people of respiratory ailments, etc. Or at least talking about doing that with other people similarly situated. And that leaves me more or less on my own today. and that's okay. It's Friday, and that means it's a good chance. I'll make this pledge, though I can't promise I'll live up to it. I will promise only to make the promise that we'll reach into pocket and try and catch up on a couple of stories, hopefully with an eye toward giving us something out of the ordinary. And that may have gotten less attention, or at least some angle of a story that's gotten lots of attention that has gotten less attention, so that you have something wonderful and intelligent to discuss with your friends over the weekend, assuming, one, that you're not working this weekend. Everybody's working for the weekend. We all know about that, of course. And two, that you have friends. I am looking around in my studio, and I see none, so I am without evidence so far, although every once in a while people tweet that I swear to God we're totally watching the show. Oh, look at that! My screen has just blanked out. Not the one that's running the show, thankfully, but one of the supplemental screens on which I try to keep Twitter open. Let's see. I was just looking for evidence that there were people out there who would consider themselves friends of the show and may have had something to say that we can share with the rest of you, but I'm so discombobulated by the fact that it's blanked out on me. All right, well, we'll just march on without it. We were prepared to do this anyway. Trying to get everything situated here. Physically, the studio is falling apart, ladies and gentlemen. I should tweet you a picture of the overhead lighting situation in this studio. We've got an under shelf fixture here that has maybe the worst and least efficient light bulbs I've ever seen. I don't know about that. Maybe they're electrically efficient. They're just 12 volt, 10 watt halogen things, and there's 6 of them, and they burn out about every week. And I don't know what it's costing to, all right, not really every week, but in a year or so since I ordered a pack of 10 of these bulbs, I've burned through them all, and I'm down to 2 of the 6 that are on. So I can't quite see what's going on, so it may affect the show. And now, of course, I've lost one of my screens, and that can't help anything. All right. So let's see what we can scrounge up for discussion today. An interesting side discussion off the air with I don't know who, just a random Twitter person. That's what's so wonderful about the Twitter machine. It's just been kind of interesting going back and forth about the accusations that Donald Trump has some sort of improper relationship with whoever they are. Forces in Russia, essentially, is what we're talking about here. And that sometimes gets mistaken for, we're worried that he has a strange and manipulative, or he's on the wrong end of a manipulative relationship with Vladimir Putin, for which there's not an incredible amount of evidence. I think he's been mostly bragging when it comes to making his claims about his relationship with Putin, and he's backed off as a result. And I hardly even know Putin, and I think they probably haven't had much, if any, direct contact. Of course, for me, this springs from the issue of not having his taxes, but more to this larger point, not having not only not having his taxes, but not having any way of really getting a handle on his finances, even if we do get his taxes. I think that I'm not an international financier, so I'm not entirely sure about the rules surrounding this, but my concern is for a guy who's got so much in the way of overseas business interests and who spends and takes in a lot of money overseas that never enters into the United States, I am not 100% certain that his taxes would reflect all of the income and influence that income sometimes brings with it, being exercised by foreign nationals, whoever they may be. I'm certainly more concerned about his relationship with Russian oligarchs than Vladimir Putin himself. So it's been an interesting discussion. I've run into somebody who I think is a liberal-leaning, progressive-leaning kind of person, but the concern that this person has is that, well, this is a very Fox News, Donald Trump kind of attack. You have no evidence of any relationship with Putin, but it's not the relationship with Putin that I worry about. There's plenty of evidence of relationship with Russian oligarchs, mobsters, and assorted other billionaires, which, by itself, you still need more proof that something untoward is happening. That's true, but there's actually a considerable amount of evidence for that. And I think we have at least circumstantial evidence. Our understanding of what Vladimir Putin is about and how he operates and what the Russian oligarchy is about is that it's a network of people whose either their political power or their money has a tremendous amount of influence on Putin and vice versa. And basically, if you're playing his game and rich, then you're doing well in Russia. And if you are rich and maybe you were playing his game but change your mind and no longer want to play along, you're dead or something close to it anyway. And the fact that a lot of people who are extraordinarily rich and are in Putin's good graces are also in sometimes unusual business relationships, sometimes unusual, not quite business, not quite personal relationships with Donald Trump. And we may never know exactly, even if we get his taxes, I'm sure that part of the relationship rests on an agreement that taxes be evaded on their transactions. But it is true that there's no proof of that. And I guess, in a way, it's very conspiracy theory-ish in that there's likely never to be proof of it, even if you produce the guy's tax returns. So that is a little bit troublesome. But I think there's more than just a little circumstantial evidence that that's something that you need to worry about with Donald Trump. And I just bring it up because I think there's sort of a nuanced and interesting argument that you might find useful in your discussions with other people. This other person sort of wanted to draw this equivalency, and we're vigilant about false equivalencies. I consider this one may be false as an equivalency, and I wondered if you might too. The idea being that, well, this is a very Trump-like or Fox News-like tactic. It's just like what they do to Hillary Clinton. They accuse her of wrongdoing based on some sort of conspiracy theory for which there's no evidence. And they do that. And if you look at it in a vacuum, if you do not have evidence of a quid pro quo type relationship as between Donald Trump and either Vladimir Putin or name your Russian oligarch or set of Russian oligarchs, then really you're doing the same sort of thing. And to an extent, that's true. However, I will say this. I would reject the false equivalency on the question of the weight of the evidence as between the two. What we have is, again, you're running up against a serious problem in that it's, as you know, frequently said to be impossible to prove a negative. It's difficult, if not impossible, to prove that there isn't any kind of secret and improper relationship as between Donald Trump and any number of Russians of any stripe. And I mean, I don't think you can get any broader brush, than that. Any Russians of any stripe. Okay, we're talking about a very particular subset of Russians, very narrow subset of Russians who are of a particular stripe. Mobsters and oligarchs, billionaires, and those are three circles that overlap pretty tightly on the Venn diagram of this narrow slice of Russians. So it is admittedly difficult without evidence of those quid pro quos, the quid pro quo of those relationships anyway, to nail them down on something like that. But the evidence that such relationships exist is there. Some of it is on the record. Some of it's not. Some of it never will be on the tax record, but there's certainly been enough of it on the social record and the media record to notice that okay, well then there is some smoke here. Somewhere we'll find some fire. But on the other hand, with Hillary Clinton, while it's true that they make accusations without evidence, there's also the problem that there exists a vast body of evidence that tends to show that the accusations that they're making are not founded on the record. There are plenty of other accusations that others make that likewise are unprovable in a way, but still you have this feeling that there's smoke and therefore possibly fire there. That's true. But if you're talking about drawing an equivalency between the weight of the evidence, Clinton has produced plenty that there's no improper relationship. And you may choose not to believe that evidence. Just as I promise you, I very likely will refuse to believe what the evidence that Trump, should he ever present any, purports to prove. I doubt very much that I'll believe him. I doubt very much whether I'll believe it's a complete record. And in that sense, we'll have mirrors on the right or even on the left. The green voting, protest voting left, they feel very much the same way, I think, about Hillary Clinton and the evidence of what she has and hasn't done. What weighs very heavily, though, is the lack of evidence, even exculpatory evidence, on the side of Donald Trump. There's a ton of exculpatory evidence with which many people have lots of problems on the Clinton side. There is nothing by way of exculpatory evidence on the Trump side, and he refuses to provide it. It may not exist, I don't know, but to say that their situations are equivalent, where one has provided a record which, viewed objectively, does not, at this point, establish this kind of direct quid pro quo relationship. It may hint at all sorts of indirect quid pro quo relationships, but it doesn't establish any. And the volume and weight of the evidence is such that you must say, well, it would certainly take an extraordinary effort to fabricate 100% of it. Maybe some of it was buried, maybe it's incomplete, but to fabricate this kind of evidence, this volume of evidence that we have before us, in the hopes of falsifying a clean record, would be a pretty Herculean task. However, on the other side, we have Donald Trump, who has made no such effort, continues to hide everything, and one of the minimum basic interests that we all have, I think, in the disclosure of the taxes of a presidential candidate is to find out what sorts of conflicts of interests might exist. Hillary Clinton's taxes show no obvious, upfront, direct conflicts of interest with foreign leaders or their power bases, but that's what people think are in the records of the Clinton Foundation. And there may be disagreement about it, but at least the record is there. Here are the donors, here are their identities, and to some extent here are the relationships which pre-existed those donations, and there's a public record about the relationships that ensued. And none of that is there for Donald Trump. And so I would reject the equivalency argument. I think that the volume of evidence that's absent but crucial to even get us to the point where Hillary Clinton is, if we consider her through the eyes of a left-leaning protest voter who's holding out against her, or a right-leaning either conspiracy theorist or Clinton hater or mainstream Republican who's not particularly, inclined certainly towards Clinton, but doesn't hold any hatred in particular for her or for her husband. They would look at this and say, all right, well, she's at least said this about what she does, whereas Trump has said nothing except what he wants you to hear. The weight of what's missing forbids, I think, any equivalency as between the two of them and as between the musings of, call them conspiracy theorists if you want to, I guess. I'll accept that. But if you're trying to think over what sorts of relationships might shape what passes for policy under the administration of either of the two of them, I think the what's missing outweighs everything else in this. I mean, this is just to simplify it. You can't do this. You can't not say who's got you and who's controlling you, or who's controlling your interests, or who's paying you for what. And that's just not happening on the Trump side. I just can't go into it any further than that. I think I might have beaten it to death on that one. Just checking in here on what David Farenthold has to say this morning to check and see if there is anything new and interesting. And I know that there is. I see it now. I see Mark Sumner's name in a David Farenthold tweet. So that's got to be interesting. And I think I know exactly what that's about. Joan told us about it on Wednesday. But Farenthold's tweet says the Con Monitor News, is that the Concord Monitor News, says real Donald Trump, that he's the fake Donald Trump, that guy, has still to give, it says, I guess it's still has still given the group $0. The GoFundMe page for them, set up by Mark Sumner of Daily Kos, however, has apparently done considerably better. Let's see. $21,000 at last report, and it looks like that's what the Concord Monitor has here. Let's just check in on that angle of things. After reportedly being stiffed by Trump, Veterans Charity rakes in donations. By Allie Morris at the Monitor. A small veterans charity on the New Hampshire-Vermont border is benefiting in a huge, they said huge, and I'm reading it as huge, way from news stories that Republican Donald Trump stiffed the nonprofit of donations. The Washington Post reported this month that Friends of Veterans in White River Junction, Vermont, never received a $1,000 donation from the Donald J. Trump Foundation, reported giving the group Trump reported giving the group in 2013 tax forms. I don't know whether anybody has checked, by the way, whether Stewie Rah-Rah's foundation gave them $1,000 or not, but worth checking into. A GoFundMe account set up a week ago to help the vets that Trump forgot has blown past its $2,000 goal and raised more than $21,400 from at least 480 contributors. It kind of knocked me for a loop, said Larry Daigle, the organization's president and a Vietnam War veteran who has volunteered with the nonprofit for 15 years. We're still kind of analyzing things ourselves. Trump's charitable giving has come under renewed scrutiny in the wake of Washington Post reports that the Republican presidential nominee, used $258,000 from his charity to resolve legal problems and used foundation money to purchase portraits of himself. News organizations that earlier this year questioned whether Trump gave money raised at a January fundraiser to veterans groups as he promised. Trump declined for months to disclose the organization names, but in May, the businessman, quote, I should say, released a list of 40 veterans groups he said received $5.6 million in donations. 3 had ties to New Hampshire. Friends of Veterans has become entangled in both stories. Daigle said a Trump staffer called him earlier this year about the January fundraiser. Daigle told the man, whose name he couldn't remember, he hoped the Vermont charity could benefit from the event. The staffer replied that Friends of Veterans was already on the radar as a beneficiary of the Donald J. Trump Foundation in 2013. I assured him that never happened, Daigle said. They were kind of shocked. Trump's foundation reported in its Form 990 that it gave $1,000 to the Vermont charity in 2013. Daigle said the group never received the money. CNN recently reported the dollars were actually received by Friends of Veterans in Palm Beach, Florida. Oh, easy mistake to make. He's passing out checks in Palm Beach, Florida all the time. But you got to get that stuff straight. Anyway, according to its president, Jerry Klein, the charity used the money to help fund a Veterans Day parade that costs about $8,000 to put on. The Florida nonprofit hasn't received a donation from Trump's foundation or his campaign since, said Klein, who served in the U.S. infantry in Vietnam. It was the one time and the only time, which is a little bit, that's kind of the story of the Donald J. Trump Foundation, which there's nothing inherently wrong with doing one-time donations to a wide variety of organizations. There's two strategies you can take, and one's more scattershot, but then you could say I'm trying to reach a larger group of people in many, in many different ways. But then again, a lot of charities find that their giving is more effective if it's more targeted and a continuing support role that a charity can count on from year to year. It's two different and both valid approaches, I would say. I don't know why you can't do one-time gifts. And $1,000 isn't much of a sustaining gift anyway, so it's one time. I'm actually not terribly upset about that one. I'm more concerned about his sudden interest in providing $150,000 at once, one time, to the Palm Beach Police Foundation, and never before and then never since. That I find highly questionable, as you know. Daigle hasn't heard from either Trump organization, either the campaign or the foundation since, but he's been getting calls from reporters. The recent Washington Post story prompted Mark Sumner, our own Devil's Tower, of course, a writer at the progressive blog Daily Kos, you can get rid of the "the" in that, thank you, to reach out to Daigle and offer to set up a GoFundMe account. Sumner did not respond to a request for comment, but Daigle, how does he do it, Mark Sumner? But Daigle said he is shocked at how much has come in. Friends of Veterans is run entirely by volunteers and spends roughly $150,000 a year helping homeless veterans, which Bill O'Reilly does not believe exists, to cover security deposits and avoid evictions. We don't just write a check and wave goodbye, he said. We're helping them get on their feet. Donald Trump writes a check and says goodbye, but that's okay. It's a different kind of charity, and I swear it's all right. Really. It is. So anyway, I thought that was at least of some interest. And again, let me check back on Farenthold because he's chasing down so many angles on this story. I'm interested to see what's the newest and latest. This is, I guess, a follow-up here. Jay Bookman at the Jay Bookman AJC, which I guess is Atlanta Journal-Constitution. If we've got there, oh, dang it. If I check on these things, I lose Farenthold's feed. But anyway, he asked whether there was any word on the various recipients of Donald Trump's generosity named, or suggested anyway, described by Ivanka's convention speech. Apparently, no one's come forward yet on that one. Let's see. I just wanted to check and see whether there was anything else new on that front. So far, no. And, we can go over to our pocket here and dig a few things out here. Well, I wanted to follow this comment here. Dwight Gerling, who I guess, are you listening? Hey, are you? Oh my God, listening live for the first time. Good morning, Dwight. How you doing? Why not talk about Taiwan is the question. That is an idea. I don't know that I could add anything insightful to it, but helpfully he has included a link which presumably has the sort of insight we're looking for. We can always share it. there's no reason why we can't have an international corner. I don't know how much I add to it, but I've never been afraid to comment on things I don't know very much about. We could try that out. He's also reacting to the equivalency question. China, but then saying equivalency, China is to Taiwan as Republicans are to Obama. Obstruct, obstruct, obstruct. Okay. Taiwan, not an area of expertise, but let's see what he's talking about, because this is always of interest to find out what's on the minds of the rest of the folks listening to the show. UN agency snubs Taiwan, recognizing Beijing's one China. Ooh, that's a tough spot to be in for the UN. I've always wondered about it. That's one of the most delicate balancing acts I can imagine having to deal with. The UN, and what a tough place to be. You're constantly walking on eggshells. An organization dedicated to human rights and advancements in opening cultures and having to deal with countries. You can't ignore China. And certainly, this very structure of the United Nations forbids ignoring China, of course, as they're one of the permanent members of the Security Council. And that's because it's like the most populous country in the world, and how do you ignore something like that? And the difficult tensions between mainland China, I guess, as they used to call it back in the day. They probably have a new PC name for it now that I don't know. And Taiwan, that's always been a tough spot. You certainly can't give over control of Taiwan and its population against the will of the population to China. But yeah, you're going to have your arm twisted all the time by the Chinese in the UN. It's one of many, many, considering you're encompassing the entire world, extraordinarily difficult situations with which they have to deal every day. What a headache. World peace. What a pain in the ass. All right. Let's take a look at the story, because we never take a look at Taiwan. So why not? Calling us out on this, are you? Okay. Alison Lampert and J.R. Wu, writing in Montreal and Taipei, respectively, for Reuters, that most international of English language news agencies, minus the BBC. All right. So I don't know anything about it. The UN Aviation Agency has snubbed Taiwan by not inviting it to its assembly in Canada, the latest sign of pressure China is bringing to bear on the new independence-leaning government of an island it views as a renegade province, which, admittedly, is a fascinating dynamic. I wish I knew more about it. I know this. I am fascinated by the idea of it being considered a renegade province. I mean, how does China deal with it? A renegade province, other than, militarily, which is what the big fear is, of course, whereas Taiwan considers itself, it's interesting. So it considers itself a different country, obviously. We've all come to think of it that way here in the United States, but the idea that they have to be described as independence-leaning government, well, that is some fascinating stuff. All the Palestinian advocates, of course, rolling their eyes and saying, what, you've never heard of this dynamic before? Diplomatically isolated Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations, which recognizes one China, centered on Beijing. China, in turn, sees self-ruled Taiwan as fit to be taken back by force if necessary, particularly if it makes moves toward independence. Again, totally amazing, because, we all have known theoretically that China has always seen Taiwan as fit to be taken back by force. It's an odd way of saying it, but it's been, thankfully, I don't know if you could call it an empty threat, but a threat that they're unwilling to, and this is what makes the dynamic so fascinating. They're unwilling to act on it. Why? Because almost certainly the UN would at least want to condemn it. Whether they could get to a formal condemnation, I guess I doubt, because of course China sits on the Security Council and they would veto such a resolution. Not that such a resolution would really do anything more or less than, the prevailing public opinion worldwide. Tisk tisk. I guess a resolution carries with it some policy implications at the UN that just wouldn't be possible without a formal vote, true. But almost nobody would give the thumbs up to an invasion of Taiwan. On the other hand, there's the question that has always hung in the balance: what in the world do you think you would do about an invasion of Taiwan? As one of the many things, by the way, that having a Donald Trump type in the White House casts into some serious doubt, which is amazing because the whole relationship depends on serious doubt on both sides about who would do what. But it's interesting. Two relatively rational actors controlling the situation keep it in stasis, right? The Chinese insist that they own Taiwan and that Taiwan is a renegade province, and this is the way you take care of renegade provinces. You send your army in and you make it not renegade. Of course, the renegade province considers itself independent, but dare not say so for fear, and this is the most ridiculous part of the whole thing. They don't say they're independent for fear. This part isn't. It's not ridiculous for them to fear invasion. But, it's weird that on the one hand, well, they certainly won't submit to rule by Beijing, and on the other hand, they won't just say, because we're a sovereign country, because they're afraid of, they'll make that concession. I will admit, I will not go around claiming to be a sovereign nation if it keeps these guys and their military out of our hair. But we are a sovereign nation. But we can't join the UN. I don't know. Would they be disallowed from joining the UN? They certainly probably want to boycott it out of frustration that China has such a prominent role in it. But anyway, meanwhile, the Chinese, who could certainly overwhelm Taiwan at any point, are, I think, restrained by the court of public opinion, which I would imagine would look disfavorably upon this. And the UN is stuck in the middle. Well, we're a human rights-centered organization, and we can't simply ignore the rights of a sovereign nation of 1 billion plus. On the other hand, we can't ignore the desires, the self-determination desires of Taiwan either. What do we do here? There's no solution out here. So the stasis is, well, the Chinese are satisfied to an extent by everyone paying lip service to the idea that, okay, Taiwan's a renegade province, whatever. In exchange for you not starting a war that could end in nuclear conflagration, we'll agree to this fiction. And the Taiwanese, likewise, will agree to this fiction. The UN will agree to the fiction. The U.S. agrees to everyone is happy with that fiction. Not thrilled, but it's better than the nuclear war one. And I guess if you introduce somebody in there who just says, to hell with it, no, I'm going to troll China on this, well, he eventually forces the issue, which we've all been dancing around for however long, since the last 50 years or so. What are you going to do if China just decided it's had enough and is going to invade Taiwan? Does the United States risk escalating things and possibly actually having a nuclear war with China to save Taiwan? Is it worth it, whatever that means? Strategically, no, but then there will be those who argue what value has the alliance or any alliance had, or what value can it have unless you defend Taiwan? No other. What other of your allies around the world are going to think that at bottom you don't really think it's strategically worth it to defend them? Belgium, France, Australia, who knows? What a disaster! What a total mess it would be if you introduced into this equation a president who could. That's where you really have to worry about a guy who could be provoked by a tweet. Imagine being provoked by an actual military invasion. People would definitely want to test Donald Trump. They may be sorry, but then I imagine he'll make them sorry in a way that will also make those of us here in the United States sorry or dead. So, as much as it might feel like empowering to say, well, I'll show you Donald Trump and me, by extension for voting for him, will make you sorry. We'll also make ourselves dead, but we'll be sorry first, or you'll be sorry first, and I'll read about that online before I die in a nuclear war. All right, sure, that seems like a fair trade. If your life is OxyContin and a trailer, maybe it is a fair trade. I don't know. That's a terrible thing to say. Since May, I'll just get back to the article here. I'm ruining things. When President Tsai Ing-wen, I'm hoping, and her Democratic Progressive Party, which traditionally favors independence from the mainland, took power in Taiwan, China has suspended official communications channels. Again, I'm fascinated by what I don't know about the actual dynamics here. The International Civil Aviation Organization, to get back to the heart of what the article is about, said arrangements for the assembly scheduled for September 27th to October 7th in Montreal did not follow the pattern ahead of the meeting of 2013 when China had asked for Taiwan to be invited. After all, they're just renegades. They're nice renegades. We have problems, but they're part of us. We want them involved. Now they say they want them blocked. ICAO follows the United Nations One China policy, the agency's communications chief Anthony Philbin told Reuters in an email. How does Anthony Philbin do it? By email. Easy answer. While arrangements had been made for their attendance at the last session of the assembly, there were no such arrangements for this one. Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council, interesting, said it had approached China about the issue in early August with a pragmatic and positive attitude, but was flatly rejected. We solemnly call on China to open its heart and think seriously, as it may face serious consequences for its one-sided actions, it said in a statement. It's possible. Taiwan Foreign Minister David Lee, thank you for adopting an easy-to-pronounce name. I'm sorry. Well, I wonder about that. When I was trying to pronounce the other Taiwanese official's name, the president, I guess. Yes, okay, just double-checking. I forgot. Was it president, prime minister? Tsai Ing-wen, and I was just worried about pronouncing it. But do you think, is the Taiwanese foreign minister's name actually David, or did he adopt an anglicized name for people like me who can't pronounce anything? Anyway, Taiwan's foreign minister, David Lee, not David Lee Roth, but just David Lee. And that would be interesting, but they're not going that route. Told reporters that diplomacy had never been an easy task for Taiwan, formerly known as the Republic of China. In the foreseeable future, I am not expecting this to change substantially, he said. China's refusal to let Taiwan attend the meeting comes as China pressures Tsai to concede to Beijing's interpretation of the One China principle, which includes Taiwan as a part of China. That would be a tough sell, I would think. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang said that as an inseparable part of China, Taiwan had no right to participate in the assembly, and that Taipei's attendance in the past was simply based on temporary arrangements. At present, our position is extremely clear. The prerequisite for Taiwan to participate in any international activity is for it to agree to the One China policy, and for this to be resolved through consultation, Lu told a regular press briefing. That's a sensible policy from the Chinese perspective. They haven't followed it all these years because, it's more expedient for them to pretend that they're respecting the rights of a weirdo renegade province and go along to get along with the rest of the Western world anyway. China has claimed sovereignty over Taiwan since 1949, when Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists fled to the island. That's the basic background of it. That's how I understood it, although it's an interesting claim of sovereignty, too, right? Well, that's one unconquered province because the nationalists are there. But I guess prior to that, I assume, the government of China, when it was Chiang Kai-shek's, claimed sovereignty over Taiwan. But what can you do? Civil wars sometimes result in bifurcated territories. I would say let it go, China. But why? It's a prosperous province. They can just continue to claim it, and the rest of the world kind of has to walk on eggshells about it because nuclear weapons. So again, it would be a great place to toss Donald Trump into the mix, don't you think? What a disaster. Okay. And there's more, although I think that might have to be the extent of the time I spend on Taiwan today, given that I can't really reliably add anything new to it. It's all worth learning about. You and I don't want to waste our time, because if you're here and I'm here, surely it's our time, and you might want to have some pizza and learn about Taiwan maybe later. But for my own edification, thanks very much. A group march in New York for UN bid, I guess, inclusion for Taiwan in the UN. Okay. Well, at least I understand that it's happening. Anyway, thanks for bringing it to our attention. And all of the rest of you are likewise invited to do the same. Redirect the show. Proclaim yourself a fan. Tell me you got an interesting link and send it. Please don't make it a Rickroll. That's the one. It's definitely going to happen now. And then we can share these stories. All right. Let's move on and bring up a couple of other subjects. Let's see. I got to scan my email as well. There was plenty to add by way of commentary that came in an email. Lots of nice things being said about the show and the various folks who appeared on it, but also, let's see, a topic being raised here. I'll note this. The continuing situation in Charlotte. Many of you already know this to be the case, but because we spend so much time on gun issues on the show, it would be worth spending a moment noting that at the heart of the problem currently in Charlotte over the police shooting death of Keith Scott was the insistence by the Charlotte police that he was armed, that he was carrying a gun. And in fact, he was unarmed, and it was likely a book that the police saw, if they were really making any kind of observation at all before shooting him, that he was carrying a book reading it while he was waiting for his son to be dropped off by a school bus. And our one listener, Brian Monroe, who I didn't. Luckily, that's not all that identifiable. Brian, of course, will be hearing this now. I don't know whether you're happy to hear that or freaking out because you're thinking you're not allowed to mention my name, and I realize I didn't get an explicit permission. But if you're thinking of which Brian Monroe it was that sent this to me, that's not him. It's a totally different one. But it was a great point, well worth bringing up. In North Carolina, you have the right, of course, to carry either concealed weapons or open carry your weapons as well. And many people noting today, including Washington Post columnists and other syndicated columnists all over, that you're supposed to be able to carry your weapons openly and without fear of being accosted for it by the police. It should not have made any difference, in theory, that he was armed. You guys in the North Carolina legislature asked for that right for your citizens. Only when it's a black person, we're getting to this. Black people who are open carrying weapons are a huge threat, and we shoot them. White people who are openly carrying weapons are obviously patriots, and we salute them and compare handguns with them. Eugene Robinson is who I have in mind. He writes a column under the title, "In America, Gun Rights Are for Whites Only," and he's largely correct about that. So I'll add this just to help make Brian's point here, which was simple enough, I think. But Eugene Robinson is a good writer and has organized his thoughts, whereas I have not. So I'll borrow from Eugene here. If you are a black man in America, exercising your constitutional right to keep and bear arms can be fatal. It can be fatal for white people too, but for different reasons, as you know. You might think the National Rifle Association and its Amen chorus would be outraged, but apparently they believe Second Amendment rights are also, they also believe are for whites only, even though they have pushed this one, at least one African American perspectives show onto their fake television channel. I should talk. We have, is this really a radio show? It goes out on one or two radio stations around the country. It's a podcast. We'll just leave it at that. In reaching that conclusion, I am accepting, for the sake of argument, the account given by the Charlotte police of how they came to fatally shoot Keith Lamont Scott on Tuesday. Scott's killing prompted 2 nights of violent protests. I don't know if anybody... There'll be disagreement with using that phrase, no doubt. But it's not mine, it's Eugene Robinson's, and you should yell at him if you feel that's necessary. That led North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory to declare a state of emergency. Last Friday, police in Tulsa shot and killed Terrence Crutcher, an unarmed black man, and the 2 incidents gave tragic new impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. Scott's relatives claim he was unarmed as well, but let's assume that the police are telling the truth, and he or both of them had a handgun. What reason was there for officers to confront him? And here I'll pause just to harken back to one of yesterday's threads, if you will. Part of the movement towards, legal conveniences for white Second Amendment enthusiasts, in addition to stand your ground, which is meant to get you out of the requirement of proving that you're actually acting in self-defense and let you skip court entirely and go merrily on your way because court's annoying. There's also a set of laws being adopted a little more slowly than the open carry and liberalized or permitless concealed carry laws around the country, but also an ill-advised and poorly thought through, I would say, set of laws adopted in places like Georgia, where realizing that openly carrying firearms would occasionally be concern for police, even among white people, they simply said, let's make it illegal. We knew that it would likely result in lots of annoying and harassing, perhaps, stops by police asking to see gun permits. And so now a openly carried firearm, which is supposed to be a right, we believe, guaranteed to you by the Second Amendment, we have doubts about that here. But if you believe that that's the case in Georgia or anywhere else, then people are going to complain. The cops are constantly stopping me and asking me for my permit. That, too, is a violation of my Second Amendment rights in their minds. It is not. But they went right ahead and simply made it illegal for police, absent some other factor like direct suspicion of involvement in a crime. They made it illegal for the police to stop you and ask you, do you have a permit for that gun you're displaying openly? For convenience sake. We'll make it illegal to inconvenience Second Amendment, those who are exercising their rights as we view them under the Second Amendment, about as technically as I can say it. Unless, of course, you're black, in which case, screw you. That's basically what's happening here. What reason was there for officers to confront him? In North Carolina, there is none. North Carolina, after all, he continues, is an open carry state. A citizen has the right to walk around armed if he or she chooses to do so. The mere fact that someone has a firearm is no reason for police to take action. This is crazy, in my humble opinion. I believe that we should try to save some of the 30,000 plus lives lost each year to gun violence by enacting sensible firearms restrictions, and that the more people who walk around packing heat like Wild West desperados, the more deaths we will inevitably have to mourn. In its wisdom, however, the state of North Carolina disagrees. I consider it a renegade province. They consider themselves a sovereign state. What can I tell you? We should continue to lobby for tighter gun laws and hope that someday the voices of reason are heard, but at the same time, we should demand that current laws be enforced fairly, even if we don't like them. Scott's death is the second recent police slaying to suggest that laws permitting people to carry handguns apparently do not apply to African Americans. In July, the police killed a black man named Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, after pulling him over for a traffic stop. You remember this, of course. We talked about it. When officers approached the car, Castile told them he was licensed to carry a handgun I can only assume that Castile made this declaration so that the officers would not be surprised upon seeing the gun. But rather than assure them that he was a law-abiding citizen exercising his constitutional right, Castile's announcement had the opposite effect. Curious, that. The horror that ensued was live-streamed on Facebook by Castile's girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds. Her cell phone video and calm, composed narration were chilling, especially to those of us who frequently commit the offense of driving while black. One of the officers shot Castile several times, and Reynolds watched as Castile slumped over next to her, his life bleeding away. Did Castile reach for his gun? Reynolds maintains he was merely reaching for his wallet to get his driver's license, as the officer had ordered. But we have seen many times, including the recent Crutcher case, that any perceived sudden movement by a black man under arrest, or even not, even if he is known not to have a weapon, can be seen by police as a deadly threat. Disclosure of the gun, meant to avert potential tragedy, seems to have invited it. It's almost as if guns attract death. It's strange. And of course, not listed in here is the also famous case that we saw on videotape in South Carolina. Cop was fired for it, but you remember the one who stopped a black man at had him pull over into a gas station parking lot, and he said, have you got your license and registration? And he's like, yeah, it's in my car. And he goes to get it, and he moved towards his car to get his AR-15, obviously, not the wallet I asked him for. And well, I guess I'm glad that it resulted at least in a termination, and I guess the guy will be put on trial for it if it hasn't happened already. But just another example. There's nothing you can do, and that's the reason you protest. There should be a million options between I'm not complying and certainly, officer, hang on a minute, but getting shot anyway. Afterward, it was confirmed that Castile did indeed have a legal permit to carry a gun. He wasn't guilty of any crime. He was just 32 and incredibly had in his brief life, been stopped a total of 52 times for nickel and dime traffic violations. That qualifies as harassment, which, by the way, is illegal if you're white and the harassment is about your gun. If you're black and the harassment's about your car, nothing we can do. Because cars are the same thing as guns, right? Or something like that. I get told that every day. It's weird how that happens. That does qualify as harassment. You're right, Eugene. I know many black men who have been pulled over for some trumped-up excuse and then felt threatened by police. Like him, for instance. It's happened to me, he says. In the Scott case, according to the Charlotte Police Department statement, officers said they went to the neighborhood looking for someone else and saw Scott inside a vehicle at the apartment complex. The subject exited the vehicle armed with a handgun. Officers observed the subject get back into the vehicle, at which time they began to approach the subject. If all they saw was a man with a gun who got out of a car and got back in, what illegal activity did they observe? None. Why did they approach the subject? Why? No idea. Why is he a subject? Because. That's police jargon. Instead of going about their business, did they have any reason to suspect it was an illegal gun? Are all men carrying guns believed to be carrying guns illegally? Or just black men? Our gun laws should be changed, but until then, however, they must be enforced equally. Does the NRA agree? In about a week, they'll say, yeah, we agree, and then go back to doing nothing, is the actual answer. Just thought we would point that out. It was a good point. Thank you, Brian, for bringing it up. And I thought it was a good excuse to share a good piece that makes plenty of good points and has lots of good jumping off places from Eugene Robinson. Always a good idea to share Eugene Robinson. Next up in Pocket, here's a curious development from out of, let me see what you can guess. I had a comment about this one that bridges the last story and this one. Perhaps you saw it on Twitter at some point last night, and it was fun. It generated a lot of confusion, the comment. Let me just get to the story itself, I guess. This is a really unusual situation that comes out of the Trump campaign, and there are so many. Secret Service, reports The Hill, The Hill's Jesse Hellman specifically. Love your work on the mayonnaise, by the way. Secret Service paid Trump's airline $1.6 million. What? Well, I'll tell you. U.S. Secret Service, the U.S. Secret Service, like the Ohio State University, has paid the Donald Trump, they get a "the," and the Secret Service doesn't, the Donald Trump campaign about $1.6 million. Why? To cover the cost of flying its agents with the GOP's presidential nominee, Politico reports. What the hell are you talking about? Well, I'll tell you. There is a routine element to this. They get right to it, second sentence. It is customary for Secret Service. That's amazing that they just don't give them these. How come they don't? Is that a style book thing? Is that an AP thing? It is customary for Secret Service to reimburse campaigns for the cost of traveling with presidential candidates. That's true. It might not be something you thought about before, but Secret Service, of course, has to travel all over the place. Who pays for the Secret Service to go? The campaigns do. But they ask to be reimbursed by the Secret Service, and the Secret Service has a budget for that. They don't travel in their own, they could have their own fleet of planes and travel alongside, but the idea, of course, is to have body men and women these days on the candidates, and you can't do that from another airplane. I just haven't worked that out yet. Okay, so it's customary for the Secret Service, without the to reimburse campaigns. It has reimbursed Hillary Clinton's campaign. $2.6 million so far in this presidential cycle. So more. So there you have it, right? False equivalency, etc. She's got $1 million more than he did. How come the story is about him? Well, here's why. Because one of Trump's companies, TAG Air, T-A-G Air Incorporated, which I'm sure is Trump Aviation Group, I think, something like that. They own all of his, and he has more than one plane. Anyway, TAG Air Incorporated is how he runs his aircraft. Because TAG Air owns the plane he travels on, he doesn't personally, because that would be a personal asset, taxable to him, et cetera, et cetera. So he had created another company that takes care of it and takes all the depreciation, as you know, from learning about that over the past couple of years, airplane depreciation actually making the news. Because TAG Air owns the plane he travels on, the government is effectively paying him because he owns TAG Air, right? The difference between his campaign and every other campaign, Clinton and everyone before them, they rarely, if ever, have either owned directly the plane they've traveled on, with or without the press. This is the first time they've ever traveled without the press on board. Whether they own the plane directly or they own the company that owns the plane, that's never been the case before. You charter a plane, and there's often some very cozy crony-type relationships behind the leasing, no doubt about it, but campaigns pay a charter company or some entity to lease a plane to use during the campaign. I say there's crony relationships. Sometimes it's a big donor who owns a plane or whose company owns a big plane, and they agree to lease, often at relatively favorable rates. Sometimes not, but they lease it to the campaign, and, you know, if it's not an arm's length transaction, then it's meant to be structured and look like a market transaction. You own a plane, I don't. I'll lease it from you, I'll pay you a market rate, and everybody who travels on it, whether by necessity or otherwise, will pay for their seat. The traveling press, when the New York Times travels with Hillary Clinton, they get billed. The campaign handles the billing on behalf sometimes of the charter company. Sometimes, I guess, I'm sure, somewhere along the line, the charter company has done it themselves. But if you fly along with Hillary Clinton as part of the press pool, you got to buy a ticket on Clinton Air, basically, and they use the payments that they get from them to pay the charter company for the use of the plane and the fuel and the staffing, et cetera, et cetera. There's no free rides on it. So, in that sense, the reimbursement sense, there's nothing new here in the Trump thing. The problem is, the interesting angle is that he owns the company that owns the plane. So, we've actually noted this before. One of the reasons it's been noted that Trump flies back to New York all the time, even at $10,000 an hour in fuel and operating costs, will simply go back home, is that Tag Air, if it burns $10,000 worth of fuel, the market price of the fuel that they use, they will bill the campaign for $10,000 plus some markup premium, a normal way of doing business if it's an arm's length transaction. And then the campaign will pay them, I don't know, let's say $15,000 for that $10,000 worth of fuel operating time, covering other overhead, making a profit, etc. Campaign, of course, turns around other people's money, OPM, as the thing that Trump enjoys so much, and pays those bills as a campaign should. It's just that very often those payments, whether for leasing office space or leasing planes, go to companies owned and controlled by Donald Trump, and so therefore the dollars go to Donald Trump. He's making money on the thing. It's very, it's easy enough to understand. It just needs to be thoroughly explained. The Clinton campaign, the Hill explains, of course, has largely relied on chartered planes from an outside private company, which, again, may very well turn out to be owned by somebody who's a friend and a big donor, and they're making money on the lease and donating some of that money back to the campaign, and it's an endless loop. But as long as you keep arm's length and document everything, it's okay. A Politico analysis found that through the end of August, Trump's campaign had spent at least $8.2 million at Trump's businesses, including payments for renting event venues and office space. It's highly unusual, certainly with the plane. It's doubly unusual that the candidate should also own a company that sells bottled water to his own campaign, a company that rents office space to his campaign, a company that rents venue spaces to his campaign. Although you could certainly put it together as a rather ingenious construction. Even if you don't already own all those assets, you could certainly, it would make a great model for the future to form those companies and subcontract, I guess, all of their inventory from elsewhere. But why not set that up? If you don't own real estate that can be used for events, and you don't own a plane that can be used for travel, and you don't own a water company that can be used to supply water to your offices, etc., you can just form a bunch of companies and subcontract for that. I will pay this leasing, this office leasing company X amount of dollars in order to make this volume of space available to my property rental shell company, and I will rent it out at price, at cost plus to my own campaign and pay for it out of campaign coffers. I suppose that's the way I would. This is the lesson of the Trump candidacy. That's how I would set up a future presidential campaign if I didn't care what people thought of me. There's good ways to make money out there, and he's at the very least, he does have a certain genius for finding ways to convert OPM into his HM, I guess you could call it. All right. Let's see. Speaking of the gun issue, as we were recently, I thought I might add this one. This one came to my attention also via Twitter, and if I can look back in my own feed to try and find out who it was that sent this to me. I think I sent them a thank you note yesterday, so I can just point to it, but it'll take a second to scroll back and find it. I do a lot of conversing on Twitter. I don't know if you know that. But somebody sent me a very interesting article from Slate, which I try not to say that out loud all that often, but a good Slate pitch. And so there really is some Slate pitchiness to it, really. But when Second Amendment rights need defending, I believe, is the title of it. Let me see if I can't find it. This is becoming more trouble than I was thinking of. There we are. That comes from another Brian, this one who spells his name with a Y, who tweets as De las Cacas. How do you like that? I don't know what that's supposed to mean. DELAS CACAS. And Brian sent me a link to this very interesting Second Amendment article from Mark Joseph Stern in Slate, and just asked me basically, what do you think of this? And I read it over, and it is interesting. I think I'm okay with these two gun cases coming out the way they did. When Second Amendment rights need defending. Subtitle, Liberals are failing immigrants, medical marijuana users, and the disabled on gun rights. Of course, jumping right to the you're failing thing puts you on the defensive, but let's get past that and read what this is about. By the way, it's illustrated with a photo of, I guess, 3 bullet holes in what looks like is meant to be glass, and captioned, if gun ownership is a fundamental right, and you could disagree that it's, and say that it's not. But if it is, as the Supreme Court seems at the moment to be saying, shouldn't liberals defend it equally for everyone? And not terribly far removed from what Eugene Robinson was saying. So I guess that was a good setup for this piece. A federal appeals court handed down a major ruling last week packed with progressive ideas about the constitutional rights of those disabled by mental illness. But liberals didn't cheer the decision or tout it as a landmark affirmation of liberty and minority rights. Why not? Because this case affirmed a right with which progressives have a rather complicated relationship, the right to bear arms. The case is the latest to illustrate a quandary that has arisen in Second Amendment jurisprudence in the years since the Supreme Court handed down District of Columbia v. Heller. Now that gun ownership has been enshrined as a fundamental right, I think it's still on rather shakier ground than that, particularly as the composition of the court has changed and will continue to change in ways that will throw that, the idea that that was part of the holding of Heller, into doubt. But granted, as a thought exercise for right now, that's what the last time the Supreme Court touched the issue they said. So that's where it stands. So now that gun ownership has been enshrined as a fundamental right, should liberals defend that right for everyone equally, even if they disagree with Heller itself? The issue has worked some progressives into knots, but I think it's an easy call. When a case involving gun rights could expand constitutional equality more broadly, liberals should support it. There's no sense in justifying or ignoring discrimination simply because the Second Amendment is involved. Consider last week's ruling issued by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit that the government cannot permanently bar once disabled individuals from purchasing a firearm. Remember, the disability here is mental illness. The plaintiff, Clifford Charles Tyler, was hospitalized 3 decades ago for a severe depressive episode after his wife left him. At the time, a court found that he suffered from mental illness and committed him to a mental hospital. Today, Tyler's physician has confirmed that he is mentally healthy and has been for years. He'd like to purchase a firearm, which isn't necessarily a very mentally healthy thing to do, but we try to look past that in the context of rights. But the federal law forbids anyone who has been adjudicated as a mental defective, and we need to work on that language, or who has been committed to a mental institution from buying a gun. So, since it was a long, long time ago, Tyler sued, arguing that the law unconstitutionally abridged his Second Amendment rights. Legally and medically speaking, depression is a disability, and progressives have fought for decades to create stronger constitutional protections for those deemed disabled by the state. Tyler's case represented an obvious opportunity to further this cause, but liberal advocacy groups balked. The burden, instead, fell on disability rights advocates to push for a ruling recognizing Tyler's ability to recover from past mental illness. I don't know. I think that burden lies in just the right place. I can still agree with the ruling and say, well, if it's a disability right, if we're going to view it as a disability rights case, then why shouldn't the disability rights advocates have the burden of pushing for a ruling recognizing his ability to recover? Who should be doing it? I don't know. When the court ruled for Tyler, it rebuked the government for attempting to enshrine a permanent stigma on anyone who has ever been committed to a mental institution for whatever reason. An extremely conservative judge hearing the case, Jeffrey Sutton, even penned a paean to the rights of the disabled, castigating the feds for applying a false, stigmatizing generalization to anyone who has ever suffered from mental health disabilities. And that's nice to see. I'm glad that he did it. I would caution you that it's not that difficult to believe that the same judge would have nothing whatsoever to do with any worry about stigmatizing generalizations against anyone who's ever suffered a mental health disability if it didn't involve guns. So we are sort of unilaterally disarming, to use an old phrase, on that subject. But again, I think I'm still generally okay with doing it, given that there's yet more to come. The Sixth Circuit's ruling wasn't especially broad with regard to gun rights. It simply held that the government must give Tyler and others in his position an opportunity to prove in court that they should have their Second Amendment rights restored. More recently institutionalized individuals, the majority noted, can still be barred from gun ownership. That doesn't sound all that unreasonable. And it's certainly, you know what, though? I guess where danger arises is that there will be Second Amendment advocates, let's say, who will argue that it's inconvenient and that previously institutionalized individuals shouldn't have to prove to a court that they should have their Second Amendment rights restored, that they ought to be automatically restored upon release. After all, is the release from a mental institution not an indication that the person is at least no longer a danger to themselves and others? If not, then don't release them. Of course, that as a proxy for licensing with a handgun, I don't know whether that should really fly, but certainly they'll be back to argue exactly that, and I think that's one of the shortcomings of this article. That's not discussed in here. But certainly the settlement of the idea that, okay, if you've been committed to a mental institution and you think you're better now and you want a gun, I'm not disappointed by the compromise that in order to get it, you got to go back to court and prove you're okay. That's okay with me, but that's exactly the kind of hassle and red tape in their minds that Second Amendment rights advocates and Second Amendment enthusiasts have been fighting successfully against in courts and in the state legislatures for the last couple of years. And they will be back very shortly to say that having to prove this to a court is an undue burden, and that they don't want to submit to individual evaluation. That's what the movement from the movement to shall issue status has been about. It used to be the case that in order to get a concealed carry permit, you had to apply to the local sheriff. And remember when, as we discussed yesterday, the local sheriff and Second Amendment enthusiasm have a long history together. For some weird reason, the ultra-conservative Second Amendment enthusiasts believe to varying degrees, up to sovereign citizen / militia enthusiasts who believe that the ultimate and only authority for law enforcement in the United States is the county sheriff. It used to be within the power of the county sheriff to decide to make a subjective call. Is the person applying for a gun permit here fit to go about armed? And it was up to them. They could say yes or they could say no. And they found out that some people, the answer was no for them, and they didn't like that. And they said, why? That's an infringement of my constitutional rights. Sure, the sheriff thinks I'm a dangerous guy, but I have a right to protect myself. And I resent that the sheriff would say no, even though he believed last week, before I applied, that the local sheriff was the ultimate authority on such things. I now don't anymore. And we're going to pass a new law and make this state a must issue, a shall issue state. What that means is that they changed the language of the state law on handguns, which ordinarily says if you want to carry a concealed weapon, you got to get the consent of the local sheriff. And it removed all of the discretion from the calculation. And that, okay, with a few concessions, like absent the documentation that the person is currently in, a mental health institution or a convicted felon or some of the other disqualifications that some states keep on their books, not all, then absent proof that one of those disqualifications currently exists, there's no room for discretion. You can't simply say, all right, the guy's not currently incarcerated. The guy's been convicted only of misdemeanors and no felonies, and he's not currently in a mental health institution, but I've been the sheriff here for 35 years. I know this is a bad dude. I run into him all the time in law enforcement actions, and I don't want him armed for the next one. No longer valid. Can't do it in a shall issue state. You don't meet any of the conditions, then you shall issue that permit. One of the first, sort of the tip of the spear of all of this legislative shenanigans with regard to guns in certain states. So, where were we on this story? Again, more recently institutionalized individuals, the majority held, can still be barred from gun ownership. For this price, the court affirmed the constitutional dignity of disabled people and broadly questioned the constitutionality of laws that interfere with disabled people's liberty based on some prejudicial presumption. Its opinion laid the groundwork for future challenges to state discrimination against people with mental illness. Is that really not a worthy trade-off for progressives? It is, of course. It's a worthy trade-off for progressives, but it's not the entirety of the transaction. I think it stands to reason, let's say, to note that while the opinion does lay the groundwork for future challenges to state discrimination against people with mental illness, it also lays the groundwork for future challenges to state discrimination in the form of forcing people with mental illness or who formerly suffered from mental illness to prove their worthiness in court each time. I don't know how that groundwork allows the court's claim that more recently institutionalized individuals can still be barred. I don't know how they coexist. I don't know for how long they will coexist. It will not be long before someone comes back and says, it's actually an undue burden to ask that I come back to court. The court doesn't, it either makes this determination in releasing me or it doesn't. If the court wants to be involved in evaluating my mental health, then let them commit me and let them require that their order be necessary for my release. But if they're not going to do that, then they're opting out of this decision and they should just opt out entirely. That will very shortly be the argument being made. In a case in the Seventh Circuit, the court provides an even starker example. The Second Amendment states that, of course, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But, in this case, the question is, who are the people in this formulation? The Constitution guarantees several rights to people and persons, but the Supreme Court has never declared who exactly counts. Citizens? Lawful residents? Undocumented immigrants? The Seventh Circuit was forced to confront this quandary head-on when considering a challenge to a federal law barring any, quote, alien unlawfully in the United States, unquote, from owning a firearm or ammunition. Mariano Meza Rodriguez, who was unlawfully brought to America as a young child and never obtained citizenship, argued that this law violated his constitutional rights after he was charged with illegal gun possession. In response, the government insisted that undocumented immigrants are not among the people whose right to bear arms is protected by the Second Amendment. 3 other appeals courts, federal appeals courts, also reached that conclusion. But the Seventh Circuit bucked this trend. The court found that the Constitution's reference to the people in the Second Amendment encompassed both citizens and non-citizens. And I think, of course, it really should. Authorized or unauthorized. Undocumented immigrants, the majority wrote, who are a part of America's national community or have developed sufficient connection with this country are protected by the Second Amendment. The court then explained that no one's right to bear arms is unlimited and found that the government still had an important governmental objective in denying gun ownership to Meza Rodriguez because he had already, quote, disrespected the law. Before his gun bust, Meza Rodriguez had had multiple brushes with law enforcement. Not addressed in here is, of course, that one of the things that conservatives, and in particular Trump conservatives, consider disrespecting the law would be his illegal status in the United States, even though he had no choice in the matter, probably, and was brought here, as they point out, illegally when he was a young child. But that would be enough for them. That would be a helpful out from that situation. They would view it. Meza Rodriguez scrambled the usual ideological factions on firearms. At Think Progress, Ian Millhiser celebrated the ruling, noting that an adverse decision would have cast into doubt immigrants' right to privacy, due process, and equal protection. Right? If you can be declared not a person of interest in terms of having rights accrue to you under the Constitution because of your immigration status, the Constitution is not worth a great deal. But Donald Trump fans no doubt would argue in almost every case that this is for citizens only, which is just not a workable reading of the Constitution. We can't really have the kind of system that we've got if the minimum basic rights that the Constitution enshrines are applicable only to citizens, because, of course, then you would just be, the police and the government would have a free hand in denying almost everything to anybody based on their immigration status, and there would be no, there'd be no defending the position in most cases. I mean, it would legalize torture, for instance, or incarceration without any due process whatsoever, as long as you could claim that a person, you could claim that a person who was a legal immigrant and held a green card but wasn't a citizen wasn't entitled to these things. And rather than try and go through the line drawing exercise of that, it's just best to say this is an enshrinement of human rights generally. In the United States, everybody gets treated this way. If you're here illegally, whatever, we'll deal with that separately. But the question of whether or not you have the right to avoid self-incrimination should be, it's probably best if we simply apply this across the board rather than try to test to whom it's applicable. It is, after all, basically, in our view, a human right. So why engage, why make work for yourself, trying to decide who gets it and who doesn't? The left-leaning American Bar Association took a different view, I guess. Let's see. Anyway, I'll remind you that Ian Millhiser celebrated the ruling. The left-leaning American Bar Association called the opinion a step in the right direction for non-citizen civil rights. Meanwhile, conservative outlets that typically tout a near-unlimited right to bear arms vigorously opposed this decision, expressing dismay that a court had granted constitutional liberties to, quote, illegal aliens, unquote. But once again, mainstream progressive groups like the American Civil Liberties Union were silent, and the task of defending Meza Rodriguez's rights fell on smaller immigrant advocacy organizations. Mesa Rodriguez was one of the most important immigrants' rights cases of the decade so far, and many of the most powerful usual allies for immigrants were missing in action. Given this track record, it's no surprise liberal litigation groups also declined to question the government's sweeping ban on firearms possession for medical marijuana users in another recent case. Federal law prohibits any, quote, unlawful user of any controlled substance, including marijuana, from owning a gun and bars gun suppliers from selling firearms to such people. The federal government currently interprets this statute to forbid even the holders of state-issued medical marijuana cards from buying a gun, no matter whether they actually use cannabis. Nevada resident S. Rowan Wilson was denied a gun under this interpretation because she held a medical marijuana card. Oddly enough, Wilson said she did not use cannabis. She obtained the card only to make a political statement in support of decriminalization. It's not a very good statement, if you ask me, but okay. In a lawsuit, Wilson argued that the federal statute interfered with her Second Amendment rights to possess a firearm. It's a complication you brought on yourself, but okay. Well, the court came out. All right. Well, I was going to say, by the way, just by way of clarification, not a statement that I think is particularly useful. It's not that you shouldn't make a statement in favor of decriminalization, but why would you? I don't know. It doesn't seem hardly worth the candle to make work for the medical marijuana decision-making apparatus if you really have no intent of using it. I think there's probably someone who was sick who could have gotten their card a little faster if you had just stepped out of the way and said, I support decriminalization. I'm not going to make work. I don't know how much. Maybe it's only 5 minutes faster. It just seems to me like, why don't you just make that statement? You support decriminalization. Good. Good for you. You can even vote for it. Wilson's case presented a prime opportunity for courts to apply more searching judicial scrutiny to the federal government's sweeping claims about the dangers of marijuana, because courts now demand that the government show some important interest in restricting firearm access. It might have forced the feds to explain the important interest in restricting the rights of medical marijuana users who obey state laws. There are plenty of liberal advocacy groups pushing for marijuana reform. If just a few had filed amicus briefs debunking the purported link between medical marijuana and gun violence, the court might have seriously questioned the government's ungrounded insistence that there is a strong link between drug use, unquote, including medical marijuana, and violence. There, I guess I would have expected to see the marijuana groups on the ground for that one. But Wilson got no support from progressive groups that have helped defend medical marijuana users in other contexts, no amicus briefs disputing the Fed's characterization of marijuana as a violence-inducing peril. Her outmatched attorney fought the case almost entirely pro bono. That left a noticeably exasperated court to rely on outdated and inappropriate studies provided by the government. Absent contradictory data provided by Wilson, the court wrote, it had, quote, no occasion to evaluate the reliability of the studies and surveys. And so the court unanimously agreed that Congress came to a reasonable conclusion in deciding that the use of marijuana raises the risk of irrational and unpredictable behavior, justifying the abridgment of Second Amendment rights. It's easy to see why left-leaning civil liberties groups stay out of legal battles like Wilson's, Tyler's, and Mesa Rodriguez's. Many still believe, as I do, that the Supreme Court was wrong to read into the Second Amendment an individual right to bear arms, but gun rights are currently ascendant in the federal judiciary, a trend that won't likely be reversed anytime soon, and firearms restrictions tend to turn rock-ribbed conservative judges into bleeding hearts. Liberal litigators should recognize that, in the right hands, the Second Amendment can be a tool for social progress. It's time to stop fretting and use it that way. Well, I'm okay with the cases coming out that way, or like the Sixth and Seventh Circuit cases. I guess I would not be so okay with the medical marijuana case on the same basis. And it is a theory that it's true that the involvement of a Second Amendment issue can, at times, turn rock-ribbed conservative judges into bleeding hearts. The problem is that the calculation here is that absent the gun angle, the conservative justices would be ashamed of themselves to simply reverse course and find against the enforcement of basic rights for other for minorities and other what do we say about this, other endangered classes, I guess, and say, yeah, well, I learned from the gun case that we really need to think of these rights as universal to all residents of the United States, regardless of immigration status. That's a very generous assumption, and liberal judges will do it. Conservative judges, I think, largely just will find other reasons to differentiate that current case from their holding in the gun-related cases earlier. And it may just be as simple as this, that the right involved is not as important or interesting to them as the Second Amendment is. I mean, it's true that firearms or gun rights are ascendant in the federal judiciary, but they're in many cases nonsensically ascendant. One of the weird idiosyncrasies of Second Amendment jurisprudence that comes from largely unfounded Second Amendment amateur constitutionalism on the subject is that there's somehow something very, very different about the Second Amendment rights. And it often stems from that weird, maybe Armando certainly would say, non sequitur from the language of the Second Amendment that seems to set the Second Amendment rights apart in some way from every other right, in that it is, as enthusiasts claim, the heart of all other rights, that no other rights are indeed valid or enforceable absent the ability to battle the government, head to head with firearms, which I think the rest of us find ludicrous, and theorists certainly, I think, should find ludicrous on its face, because of course, the idea that one of the troubling paradoxes of that method of thought is, one, you can't dismiss it entirely, and the other troubling paradox is that if you are guaranteeing or attaching what you call rights to yourself at the point of a gun, then really what we're talking about here aren't rights after all. Rights are things that you should be able to enforce as of right, because they're right, because they are rights that are guaranteed to you. You should be able to vindicate them in court. If you need to vindicate them at the point of a gun, well, I mean, perhaps I can't help but invite you to do so, or I certainly can't tell you can't, but we haven't really evolved all that far. A written constitution is of considerably less use to us than we thought if we're still having to guarantee those rights by force of arms. Our revolution is incomplete, one might say. But Second Amendment enthusiasts no doubt believe that the revolution is ongoing and, of course, must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of tyrants like certain circuit court judges. Very fascinating look, I think. A good reminder that all issues in the liberal view are nuanced. I add only to that view, to that notion, the caution that almost nothing is nuanced to the conservative mind unless they need, for the sake of professional ego, if they're judges or sometimes legislators, they feel like, well, I was taught in law school that I need to be able to distinguish cases on serious, significant grounds if I need to dispense with their holdings and go another direction. So I'll contort myself in order to find it. And then I guess that tradition falls away increasingly among the most ideological conservative judges and justices in this country. They simply decide what the outcome is that they want and then invent distinguishing facts or interpretations of law to make it possible for them, in their minds, they've justified coming to the opposite conclusion. That's the only time nuance ever matters for them, and increasingly it doesn't even matter. They just say, essentially, the judicial equivalent of, well, I'm trying to make America great again, and that requires this outcome, and that's all there is to it. And if you're the right kind of judge, i.e. one of the 9, and you can get 4 others to agree with you, you're right. That's the law from here on in. Fantastic system we've got, but the line has to be drawn somewhere. That's a notion that could be explored extensively, but I think will lead me down a path where I can no longer rely on anyone else's organized thoughts for guidance. So I'll turn away and turn back to Pocket and see what I can find by way of interesting weekend reading that I feel like we've skipped. What I'll have to do, you'll have to indulge me here. We're going to scroll down and we'll just sort of peruse the list and see what we can find. I did get an interesting and helpful tip on using Pocket. I haven't implemented it yet. I complained a while ago, and maybe it was even on another Friday, that I needed a better system of organizing these stories into topic areas. And there is, in fact, a very simple and straightforward tagging system that would do that for me. It's just a lot of work. So I'm going to have to go back and do that work at some point. All right, let's see. I have some new-ish news on Corey Lewandowski and his relationship with the Trump campaign and CNN. I think we should probably just toss that out there just so you are up to speed on these things. Eric Wemple, writing for the Washington Post, confirmed Trump campaign is controlling every word of prominent CNN commentator. In other words, just what you thought was going on appears to be going on, which I would submit to you is circumstantial evidence on the opening question of the show of Donald Trump's relationships with Russian oligarchs and mobsters. It's just conjecture, but just like you thought it was conjecture at one point that Lewandowski was going to remain connected with the campaign and not be a fair and independent contributor to CNN, it turned out to be that there was, in fact, with a little bit of searching, solid evidence of exactly that. It's just what you thought. He's supposed to be an open book in terms of the Trump campaign, in terms of what kind of person he is. The stuff he says, he means it. Okay? An insightful statement has emerged from the Donald Trump campaign. It concerns Corey Lewandowski, the former Trump campaign manager who was apparently fired from his post in June, then quickly signed on as a political commentator for CNN. A couple of weeks later, CNN self-disclosed that their new hire was receiving severance payments from the campaign. Those payments, $20,000 a month to Lewandowski's Green Monster Consulting, continued into August, according to the latest round of campaign finance reports. In response to questions about the setup, the Trump campaign said Lewandowski, who is no longer involved in the campaign, continues to receive monthly severance payments. The campaign will continue to honor its contract with Mr. Lewandowski, which stipulates that he will be paid through the end of the year. These payments are in no way compensation for services rendered. Bolding added to highlight a convenient circumstance. That would be paid through the end of the year. Hefty payments will continue to land in Lewandowski's account for as long as the Trump campaign can benefit from the pro-Trump statements that he makes on the air. Very predictably, it's apparent that Lewandowski is bound by the non-disclosure and non-disparagement clauses that Trump and company require of other employees, as we've discussed previously in this space. The statement issued by the Trump campaign contains a lot of serious omission, says D.C. employment lawyer Deborah Katz of Katz, Marshall & Banks, LLP. It fails to note whether Lewandowski is bound by either a non-disparagement provision or confidentiality strictures of any other provision that bars him from speaking without fear of having his severance payments cut off. Until that question is answered, we can only infer that Lewandowski remains on a short leash. Severance is quite commonly paid in a lump sum. Now, there's a wrinkle here that merits further disclosure. In her experience, Katz has found that when organizations like a campaign presumably want to muzzle a former employee, they may seed the separation agreement with what's known as a balloon payment at the end of the severance term. It's a large sum that acts as a carrot, in Katz's phrasing, to ensure loyalty and compliance of such an employee. The Eric Wemple blog has asked both the Trump campaign and CNN if such an arrangement is in place for Lewandowski. Also, has CNN even reviewed Lewandowski's separation agreement with the Trump campaign? CNN has been stalwart and steadfast in not replying. How do they do it? To such questions in regard to Lewandowski's arrangement, even as it has covered in great detail the issues of transparency that have surfaced in the 2016 campaign, when they relate to Hillary Clinton, of course. In a town hall session with his own colleagues, CNN Worldwide President Jeff Zucker justified Lewandowski's hiring by citing the need to maintain balance within its commentator ranks, according to the Huffington Post's Michael Calderon. I note, by the way, that the panels hardly ever include advocates for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, but not that kind of balance, the other kind. The one party and then the other party kind of balance. The network did reply quickly to one inquiry from the Eric Wemple blog this morning about a report from Mediaite indicating that Lewandowski had been suspended. Not true. He has not been suspended, and he'll be on air later today, responded the CNN spokeswoman. How does she do it? Why can't this network act on a good idea when it's presented to them? With its stubbornness on Lewandowski, CNN is sliding from an admirable objective, securing the input of Trump World on CNN programming, not even certain that that's so good, to an ethical no-no, paying sources for content. This is not a thought scoop for the Eric Wemple blog. Jay Rosen already thought of this. In his tweet, he noted, I'd respect a little CNN's decision to hire Lewandowski if they announced at the same time a change in policy. They now pay their sources. That would clear things up. Anyway, so that relationship continues unabated. And it leads us, I guess, to another issue, the weird contracts that Trump World appears to have with people on every level. Let's see. I know I've put this one aside at some point. We just have to kind of scroll to it and find it and get the right piece here. It's not immediately apparent because I haven't organized my things just yet. But let's see. Somewhere here I have a piece. Here we are. Donald Trump volunteers are signing a lifelong contract never to criticize him, according to CNBC reporting. Let's see. This Jeff Stein, and I guess in partnership with Vox on this one. Let's take a look at this. Sign up to volunteer for Donald Trump's campaign. Volunteer. Okay? And you might be giving up more than you bargained for. Earlier this week, reporters began poring over the 2,271-word non-disclosure agreement that the Trump campaign requires its volunteers to sign. The forms are extraordinarily broad, virtually prohibiting any volunteers from criticizing Trump or his family for the rest of their lifetimes, according to Rachel Sklar, a lawyer and CNN contributor. On Twitter, Sklar noted that the forms also bar volunteers from criticizing Trump's brands, because they're the same thing, of course, disclosing anything personal about Trump, including his taxes, or from even employing people who work for Hillary Clinton's campaign. That last one's illegal, Sklar says. This tweet was from when? I don't know, September 2nd. She notes, one, I took a look at the legal form agreement mandatory for Trump online volunteers. Many flaws, she notes. She continues to go on and say, it's literally framed as an offer on the website where you click to agree. It's also called a non-disclosure agreement, and the URL is talk.donaldjtrump.com/user/non-disclosure. But it includes way more than that, and there's a picture included of the text. And before you can even sign up, you got to click through. I agree to non-disclosure agreement. Put your signature here online. It's written to protect all of Trump's family and all of Trump's enterprises and anything created to benefit the same. Broad AF, and you know what that means. When you are, and it's funny too, it also includes Trump's siblings and their respective spouses and children as well. Wow. It assumes any breach of this overbroad AF as F agreement causes, quote, irreparable harm, fully indemnified, of course. Lots of assumptions being made. They just throw it in there to scare you for the most part. All of it is challengeable, but it'll cost you, and it'll cost you big. And sometimes it's better to just end up agreeing not to say anything, if you think it's enforceable at all, at any level. Her seventh tweet here, even by the grossly permissive standards of Citizens United, coercing your employees is completely illegal. No, you can't prevent your employees from volunteering for Hillary, also coercive and illegal. And this one's charming. The terms of this agreement were totally negotiable. There's a note in the part of the written agreement with which you're just clicking to give your assent to. It says here that everyone who signs it has reviewed each of the provisions in this agreement carefully and has negotiated or had full opportunity to negotiate the terms of this agreement, specifically including but not limited to paragraph 7 hereof. You waive any claims that may be available at law or in equity to the effect that you did not have the opportunity to do so or to consult with counsel. Click here to show you've consulted with counsel, right? Trump is fine with his volunteers disparaging Mike Pence, by the way. He's not a Trump person. And Trump person is actually defined in the terms of the agreement. Trump person means each of the following: Mr. Trump, each family member, each Trump company, including but not limited to the company, and each family member company. So you can't criticize Ivanka's shoe company either. Nothing about Pence in there. Not sure how you can submit to binding arbitration and still retain the right to sue, but whatever. That's in there as well. Never say anything bad about a Trump person forever and ever. That's the upshot of it. There's more, of course, and it includes Trump steaks, as it turns out. You can't say you didn't like it either. Real lawyers, Rachel says, help, I'm out of practice. If a journo like... pointing out to one of the folks on Twitter, signed this thing, then challenged it. Could it kill the whole thing? One whopper spotted by another Twitter user and noted herein, information that Mr. Trump insists remains private would, of course, include his taxes and give him an extraordinary amount of discretion over what he can and can't sue over. And given that he thinks he can sue for, what was it, irresponsible intent, I don't know that we want this guy interpreting the law for anybody. There was that, and there was an earlier one along similar lines that I would have to scroll down a little even further for. But let's see if I can't find this one within a reasonable amount of time. But similar about what you had to sign in order to volunteer. But not turning it up all that easily. But speaking, I guess, of other people who work for him and the conditions under which they do so, I don't think we ever noted this story, though it was well circulated at the time, and once again we'll borrow from the Washington Post. Josh Rogan, I believe, on this one, inside the collapse of Trump's D.C. policy shop. Just interesting that that hasn't been much more discussion about this, because you would think that the collapse of a D.C. policy shop would be a major issue for a presidential campaign. It's just not, because this one is all about putting on the trappings of a campaign, and only the trappings. So much so that one of the things that I would ordinarily have considered trappings, having a policy shop that produces policies, is no longer necessary. Policy, that's not a necessary trapping. When I say the necessary trappings, I mean candidate wears a suit, candidate says he's qualified, candidate has a sufficient roster of people to not comment on anything and to issue no comments, and a plane, and that there be events and the press be, for the most part, able to cover them in ways that will make it appear on television that a campaign is happening. That's the minimum basic trappings. I guess if they lost any more of that, they'd be in trouble. But check this out. The Trump campaign built a large policy shop in Washington, as they had to, we thought originally, that has now largely melted away because of neglect, mismanagement, and, guess what, promises to pay that were never honored. Many of the team's former members say the campaign leadership never took the Washington office seriously and let it wither away after squeezing it dry. Holy mackerel, who would have predicted it? Donald Trump often brags about having experts and senior former officials advising him. Of course, he believes this dude, his gastroenterologist, is a good doctor, and we may have problems with that. Wednesday night, in a forum on national security, he said, "We have admirals, we have generals, we have colonels, we have a lot of people that I respect." It's true that Trump is getting high-level advocacy advice on a regular basis from senior experts such as Rudy Giuliani and retired Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, but Trump has never acknowledged the policy shop based in Washington that has been doing huge amounts of grunt work for months without recognition or compensation. That's the problem. Since April, advisors never named in campaign press releases have been working in an Alexandria-based office, writing policy memos, organizing briefings, managing surrogates, and placing op-eds. They put in long hours before and during the Republican National Convention to help the campaign look like a professional operation. That's the truest sentence you'll ever hear about it. But in August, shortly after the convention, most of the policy shop's most active staffers quit. Although they'd signed non-disclosure agreements, several of them told me on background that the Trump policy effort has been a mess from start to finish. It's a complete disaster. One disgruntled former advisor told me. They use and abuse people. The policy office fell apart in August when the promised checks weren't delivered. Familiar. 3 former members, all of whom quit in August, told me that as early as April they were promised financial compensation, but were later told that they would have to work as volunteers. They say the leaders of the shop, Rick Dearborn and John Mashburn, told many staffers that money was on the way, but then they were unable to deliver. Dearborn is a Senator Jeff Sessions staffer, his chief of staff, in fact, while Mashburn is the former chief of staff for Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina. I heard it from Dearborn. I heard it from Mashburn. It was understood that we would be paid. The campaign never discussed how much the pay would be. It was never in writing. Buyer beware. Whoops. That's what one staffer said. He said, who quit last month, there were some people who were treating it as a full-time job. I suspect that those people were quite astonished when the pay didn't come through. There's definitely some schadenfreude in this one. I mean, I definitely want to say, sorry, suckers, except that I'll be disappointed when I ask the question, so do you still support Trump? Yes. One former advisor told me promises of pay were made when Corey Lewandowski was campaign manager, but then in July, after Paul Manafort took over, he said the policy shop positions would remain unpaid. Dearborn tried repeatedly to get a budget approved by New York headquarters for the staff, but failed. He's a failure. He can't close. He can't close a deal, this guy. Some former staffers say Dearborn was not responsible for the broken promises of pay for the policy staffers. Rick Dearborn was always professional and forthcoming with me, said Pratik Chougule. I'm just murdering that name, I'm sure. Wow, Chougule, who held the title of policy coordinator in the D.C. Trump office until he quit last month. Is that the guy we heard from? What, did he write another op-ed that we were looking at? Where that would be in the archives. Gosh, that's familiar. Or maybe it's just familiar sounding. Maybe it just rings a bell because it's a similar name and I'm confusing the two. But wasn't there a like a terrible op-ed maybe in The Hill or Roll Call or something like that? Let me take a quick scroll and see if I can't find that. I have that feeling that there was somebody who wrote something and he was like, I'm a former staffer and something. Do you remember? You probably do, but I can't hear you at home. Dang. And I don't know where I would have stored it either. Are these from, was this it? Hillary's alt-right smear will backfire. Yeah, that's the guy. Good job, Dave. You figured that one out. Remember, Hillary's alt-right smear will backfire? When did we read that? I can't remember. Well, that's the guy. Pratik Chogule, or whatever terrible job I'm doing. I'm actually, despite the fact that I owe you nothing and certainly no respect whatsoever, I'd like to be able to get your name right so that I don't, annoy the rest of the, your ethnicity or culture, who may be fabulous people. But yeah, that was right. And I read down at the bottom the guy's qualifications, where he was a former policy coordinator to the presidential campaigns of Mike Huckabee and Donald Trump. Former State Department political appointee in the George W. Bush administration. So that's the guy named in this thing now, too. How interesting. Dang. And it took me out of the thing, and now I'm going to have to scroll all the way back down and find this thing again. And now I'm in the archives instead of my list. And all right, so that's disrupting things terribly. Where... Now I'm super curious to hear what it was that he was talking about here and what use he was to this article. Here's where you really need a producer, right? All right, scrolling. There we are, inside the collapse of the D.C. policy shop. Okay, Rick Dearborn was always professional and forthcoming for me. That's what Pratik Chogule has to say here. That's what he's saying in this piece. He held the title of policy coordinator in the D.C. Trump office until he quit last month. So now we can just say, oh, so you were a Trump volunteer? Why are we listening to you? I was certainly under the expectation I would be paid at some point, but I don't blame Rick Dearborn. No, you have to take responsibility for it yourself. That's what Republican doctrine says. Campaign spokesman Jason Miller acknowledged that the Washington policy office grew smaller in August, but he called the effort a success. The policy shop has been very successful with the campaign. It's been a large part of the reason Trump has gone on such a positive run over the month of August, Miller said. Following the convention, much of the activity has gravitated towards New York, simply because that's where the full-time multi-floored campaign operation was set up. As for promises to pay the policy staffers, Miller said no such oral agreements were made. He said Dearborn is getting paid, in addition to Senate staff salary as well, by the way, but said Dearborn is following all ethics rules that apply to staffers who also work for campaigns. So don't look. Everything is fair and going as planned. There's plenty more, but apparently the last straw came for some in early August when the Washington Policy Shop held 2 marathon work sessions designed to plan out how to get Trump ready for the policy portions of the upcoming presidential debates, and it turns out he didn't give a damn, and so you're all fired. The end. I just thought that was a very interesting story. I'll follow up with some more thoughts about that perhaps next week. Of course, coming up next is the after show. Let's see if I can't get Skype. Why won't Skype open for me? What would be the point of doing that, one wondering? Well, the point would be to try and find out what's going on the after show. But for some reason, it is closed and crashed and gives no indication of wanting to let me in. How interesting is that? Well, stay tuned at any rate for the after show for all of the fabulous Friday activities that they'll be bringing up and closing out the weekend. All the stuff that you'll be discussing over the weekend that I'm in.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks very much for listening. Do stay tuned, as I mentioned, to the after show. Wink and Justice working hard to bring you all the stuff I ignored, and they carefully prepared in detail for me to read to you, but my Skype crashed and it wouldn't let me read it. I'm very sorry, but I'm sure that by Monday all will be well. Take care and enjoy your week.